Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., the sidewalks outside the Harrison Financial Building became crowded with people eager to get home. Business executives hurried toward their cars, office workers rushed to catch buses, street vendors called out to passing customers. No one seemed to notice the small boy standing quietly beside the old bus shelter. He couldn't have been older than 12. His clothes were faded, his shoes had holes in the soles. His face carried the exhaustion of someone far older than his age. Yet, despite everything, he never shouted, he never grabbed anyone. He simply waited, hoping that someone would look into his eyes long enough to notice his hunger. Most people never did. Some walked past as though he didn't exist. Others frowned at him before quickly looking away. A few even muttered, "Another kid pretending to be homeless." The boy had become invisible to the world. Almost invisible. Because every evening, one man always stopped. His name was Robert. At 58 years old, Robert had built a reputation that everyone in the city admired. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't famous. He was simply known as one of those rare people who believed kindness should never depend on someone's status. Every evening after leaving work, he crossed the same street, and every evening, the little boy quietly stepped forward. "Sir?" Robert stopped. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." The words never changed, neither did Robert's response. Some days he handed the boy 5 pounds, some days 10. Occasionally, if business had gone well, he'd buy him a warm sandwich and a bottle of water instead. He never asked questions. He never expected gratitude. To Robert, feeding a hungry child wasn't charity. It was simply the right thing to do. The boy accepted the money with both hands every single time. "Thank you, sir." Those 3 words always sounded genuine. As Robert continued walking home, the boy would watch until he disappeared around the corner. Then he would quietly whisper, "One day I'll repay your kindness." No one heard him, not even Robert. One Saturday afternoon, Robert wasn't working. His wife Margaret suggested they visit the downtown market together. "It's been weeks since we've gone shopping," she smiled. Robert laughed. "I suppose you're right." The weather was perfect. Families filled the streets. Children laughed around the fountains. Musicians performed on the sidewalks. Everything felt peaceful. As they crossed one of the busiest intersections, someone suddenly shouted from behind, "Sir, sir, please wait." Margaret turned first. A young boy was running towards them as fast as he could. His breathing was heavy. His face was covered in sweat. The moment Robert saw him, he recognized him immediately. It was the same homeless boy. Robert smiled gently. "I'm sorry, I wasn't at work yesterday, was I?" The boy nodded. "I waited until it got dark." Margaret looked confused. "You know him?" Robert quietly explained. "I see him every evening after work. He's alone, no parents, no family. Sometimes I give him a little money for food." Margaret's expression changed instantly. She walked closer to the boy. "What is your name?" "Ethan." "How old are you?" 12. "And where are your parents?" The question silenced him. His eyes slowly filled with tears. "I don't have any." For several seconds, no one spoke. Margaret gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." Ethan forced a weak smile. "It's okay. I've learned to live with it." But Margaret knew no child should ever have to say those words. She opened her purse. Inside was the money she had withdrawn that morning for shopping. Without hesitation, she pulled out 2 crisp 100-pound notes. Robert looked surprised. "So much?" Margaret smiled. "It's not charity." She knelt in front of Ethan. "I want you to promise me something." He nodded silently. Don't spend the rest of your life asking strangers for help. She carefully placed the money into his hands. Use this to start something, anything. Sell coffee, sell newspapers, wash cars. Do whatever honest work you can, but never believe that begging is your only future. Ethan stared at the money. He had never held so much in his life. His hands began to shake. Margaret looked into his eyes and said words that would stay with him forever. Every time you beg, the world takes away a piece of your dignity. But every time you earn even a single dollar honestly, you earn back your self-respect. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't cry because he was hungry. He cried because someone believed he could become more than a beggar. He wiped his tears. "I promise." Margaret smiled warmly. "I believe you." Robert placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "So do I." Neither Robert nor Margaret realized that this small conversation was about to change not only Ethan's life, but their own future as well. That evening, Ethan didn't spend a single dollar, not one. Instead, he walked for hours through the city, holding the folded bills tightly inside his jacket. Every few minutes, he touched his pocket just to make sure the money was still there. For someone who had spent years wondering where his next meal would come from, this wasn't just money, it was hope. But hope also brought fear. What if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if I'm simply not good enough? Those questions echoed inside his mind long after the streets had grown quiet. As the sun disappeared below the skyline, Ethan wandered into an old public square where street performers usually entertained tourists. Normally, he would have ignored them, but something unusual caught his attention. A large crowd had gathered around one performer. People were clapping, laughing, cheering. Curious, Ethan squeezed through the crowd. Then he froze. Standing in the middle of the square was a man with no arms. Both of his arms ended just below his shoulders, yet somehow he was painting beautiful landscapes using only his feet. His brush moved gracefully across the canvas. Every stroke seemed effortless. The audience watched in amazement. Some people applauded. Others dropped money into a wooden box beside him. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. When the painting was finished, the crowd erupted into applause. A middle-aged man stepped forward with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, many of you admire his artwork, but very few know his story." The crowd fell silent. "This is Daniel. He was born without arms. When he was only a few hours old, his biological parents abandoned him outside a hospital." Gasps spread through the audience. They believed his disability made him worthless. They left him there to die. The man paused before continuing. "I happened to be driving past that morning. I heard a baby crying. I found him wrapped inside an old blanket. I couldn't leave him there, so I brought him home and raised him as my own son." Daniel smiled at the older man with tears in his eyes. The man continued, "I never taught Daniel to feel sorry for himself. I taught him one thing. If God closes one door, work hard enough to build another." The audience applauded once again. Daniel picked up another brush, using only his toes. Then he began writing something across a blank canvas. Slowly, carefully, one letter at a time. When he finished, he lifted the painting for everyone to see. It read, "Ability is stronger than disability." The crowd stood to their feet. Many people wiped away tears. Ethan couldn't move. He simply stared. His chest felt heavy. Inside his heart, something was changing.
If he can do all of this without arms, what excuse do I have? I have both hands. I can walk, I can carry things, I can work. So why am I begging? Margaret's words echoed inside his mind. Every time you beg, the world takes away a piece of your dignity. For the first time, Ethan realized she wasn't trying to insult him, she had been trying to save him. That night, he made a promise, not to Robert, not to Margaret, to himself. I will never beg again. No matter how difficult life becomes, I will earn every meal with my own hands. The next morning, instead of standing outside the office building, Ethan walked across the city looking for work. He knocked on restaurant doors. Nobody hired him. He asked grocery stores. Everyone refused. Construction sites turned him away because he was too young. Hour after hour, rejection followed rejection. By sunset, his feet hurt, his stomach growled. His hope was fading again. Then the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the cold evening air. Across the street stood a tiny family-owned coffee cart. A long line of customers stretched down the sidewalk.
The owner worked nonstop, pouring coffee, taking payments, preparing sandwiches. He barely had time to breathe. Ethan quietly watched from a distance. People weren't just buying coffee, they were buying warmth, conversation, comfort. The owner greeted every customer by name. Everyone left smiling. For almost an hour, Ethan simply observed. Then, he finally gathered enough courage to walk over. "Excuse me, sir." The owner looked up while filling another cup. "Yes? I have a question." The man smiled. "Go ahead. If someone wanted to start selling coffee, could they actually make a living doing it?" The old coffee seller laughed kindly. "If they're willing to wake up before sunrise, work harder than everyone else, and never cheat their customers, they can build a life." Ethan listened carefully. The old coffee seller noticed the determination in the boy's eyes. "Thinking about opening your own cart?" Ethan nodded. "I don't have much money, but I want to work." The old coffee seller smiled. "I like that answer." He pointed toward another neighborhood across town. "Don't open one here. My customers have been coming for 20 years, but the east side of the city," he paused, "they don't have a good coffee stand. You could build something there." Ethan looked in that direction. For the first time in years, his future no longer looked empty. It looked possible. He smiled. "Thank you, sir." The coffee seller smiled back. "Remember something, kid. People don't come back because of coffee. They come back because of how you make them feel." Ethan would never forget those words. They would become the foundation of an extraordinary life. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay awake inside the abandoned storage shed where he usually spent his nights, staring through a broken window at the stars above. For years, he had dreamed of escaping poverty, but tonight, for the first time, that dream felt real. Margaret had given him hope, Daniel had given him courage, and the old coffee seller had given him direction. Now everything depended on one thing: his willingness to work harder than he ever had before. Before sunrise the next morning, Ethan was already walking through the city. He visited a second-hand market where people sold used furniture, old kitchen supplies, and worn-out equipment. He counted every pound carefully. He couldn't afford mistakes. After hours of searching, he found an old portable coffee cart. Its paint was peeling. One wheel squeaked loudly. The countertop was scratched, but the frame was solid. The elderly owner smiled. "It isn't pretty, but it'll still make you money." Ethan bought it. Then he purchased a small kettle, paper cups, coffee beans, milk, sugar, and a simple painted sign.
By the time he finished, almost every pound Margaret had given him was gone. He looked at the few coins left in his pocket. If this failed, he would have nothing. Absolutely nothing. The next morning, long before sunrise, the city was still asleep. Streetlights flickered softly. Cold air drifted through empty streets. Ethan pushed his little cart nearly 2 miles to the east side of the city. His hands hurt, his feet ached, but he never stopped. Finally, he reached the small corner the old coffee seller had recommended. There were no fancy cafes, no competition, just office workers, construction crews, delivery drivers, and bus passengers passing through every morning.
He took a deep breath, whispered a quiet prayer, then lit the small burner. The smell of fresh coffee slowly filled the cold morning air. His voice trembled at first. Fresh coffee. Almost nobody heard him. He tried again, a little louder. Hot coffee. Fresh, hot coffee. People kept walking. Nobody stopped. 10 minutes passed, then 20, nearly an hour. Not a single customer. His confidence slowly disappeared. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe he wasn't meant to succeed. Just as he began thinking about packing everything away, an elderly woman walking her dog stopped beside the cart. "Young man, 1 coffee, please." Ethan smiled nervously. "Of course, ma'am." His hands shook while preparing the cup. He worried it wouldn't taste good enough. The woman took 1 sip. She smiled. "This is wonderful." Then she reached into her purse and placed £5 on the counter. "The coffee costs £3, Ethan said. She gently pushed the extra money back toward him. "The extra 2 are for your courage." Tears almost filled Ethan's eyes. His very first customer. A few minutes later, a taxi driver stopped. Then a construction worker, then 2 delivery men. Word spread surprisingly fast. "There's a new coffee cart down the street. The young kid makes great coffee." By lunchtime, he had sold almost every cup he had prepared. When the final customer left, Ethan quietly counted the money. After paying for supplies, he had actually earned a profit. It wasn't much, but it was honest. For the first time in his life, every dollar in his pocket had come from his own work. He looked toward the sky, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you." Not because he had become rich, but because he no longer had to beg. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Every morning, Ethan arrived before anyone else. Every evening, he was the last to leave. He cleaned his cart until it shined. He remembered every regular customer's favorite order. Some liked extra milk, others preferred strong black coffee. Many were surprised that such a young man remembered their names. But Ethan never forgot anyone, because he remembered exactly what it felt like to be forgotten himself. That was why every customer left with more than just coffee. They left feeling noticed, valued, respected, and without realizing it, they kept coming back. One rainy winter morning, business was unusually slow. An exhausted construction worker stopped at the cart. He searched every pocket, then sighed. "I forgot my wallet." "It's okay," Ethan smiled. "You can pay tomorrow." The man looked surprised. "You don't even know me." Ethan poured the coffee anyway. "Someone once trusted me when I had nothing. I think it's my turn to trust someone else." His eyes filled with gratitude. The following morning, he returned. Not only did he pay, he brought 6 of his coworkers. Within a week, They had all become regular customers. That single act of kindness turned into dozens of loyal customers. As the months passed, the small coffee cart became one of the busiest morning stops in the neighborhood. People no longer said, "Let's grab a coffee." They said, "Let's stop by Ethan's." His coffee wasn't the cheapest. It wasn't even the fanciest. People came because Ethan always greeted them with a smile, because he remembered their names, because he listened when they needed someone to talk to. The coffee brought them in, but Ethan's kindness kept them coming back. Little did he know, this tiny coffee cart was only the beginning of an extraordinary journey. 5 years passed. The little coffee cart that once stood quietly on a lonely street corner had become one of the most popular coffee spots in the city. Every morning before sunrise, a long line of customers stretched along the sidewalk. Office workers stopped there before work. Taxi drivers refused to begin their shift without Ethan's coffee. College students gathered there to study. Even tourists searched online for Ethan's Coffee Corner. The small hand-painted sign was gone. In its place stood a warm, beautiful cafe filled with the rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee. The walls displayed photographs of the cafe's earliest days, including one picture of a skinny 12-year-old boy standing proudly beside an old, rusty coffee cart. Whenever customers asked about it, Ethan simply smiled. That's where everything began. Success had changed his life, but it had never changed his heart. Every Monday morning, before opening the cafe, Ethan visited the homeless shelter nearby. He quietly paid for breakfast. He never asked anyone to announce his name. He didn't want applause. He only remembered how hunger once felt. Every Christmas, he bought winter coats for children living on the streets. Every summer, he offered free jobs to teenagers who needed their first opportunity. Some became baristas, some learned accounting, others discovered talents they never knew they had. Whenever someone thanked him, Ethan always gave the same answer. "Someone believed in me before I believed in myself. I'm only passing that kindness forward." One afternoon, an elderly man slowly entered the cafe. His white hair was neatly combed. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned on a wooden cane. The moment Ethan looked up, he smiled. "Mr. William!" It was the old coffee seller who had once encouraged him to open his first coffee cart. Ethan hurried from behind the counter and hugged him warmly. The customers smiled as they watched. William laughed. "You've become a busy man." Ethan shook his head. "I wouldn't be standing here without you." William looked around the cafe. The place was full. Employees moved confidently behind the counter. Customers laughed together. Fresh pastries filled the display shelves. "You built all this?" he whispered. Ethan smiled. "No." He glanced around the room. "Many people helped build this." William looked at him proudly. "You never forgot where you came from." Ethan's smile softened. "How could I?" Later that evening, after closing the cafe, Ethan opened a small wooden box hidden inside his office. Inside were only 3 things: the faded handwritten sign from his first coffee cart, a worn photograph of himself at 12 years old, and 2 old 100-pound notes. The exact serial numbers had been carefully written beside them. He had never spent Margaret's original gift. Instead, after earning his first profit, he quietly exchanged the notes at the bank and kept the originals forever. To anyone else, they were just pieces of paper. To Ethan, they represented the day someone gave him dignity instead of pity. He gently touched the notes and whispered, "Thank you, wherever you are." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, life was moving in a very different direction for Robert and Margaret Harrison. Time had not been as kind to them. Robert had officially retired. After nearly 40 years of honest work, he finally left the office carrying nothing more than a small box of personal belongings and a certificate thanking him for his service. Margaret waited outside the building. When Robert walked through the doors, she hugged him tightly. "You've earned this." Robert smiled. "I hope so." The retirement package wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough for a peaceful life, enough to travel occasionally, enough to spend time with grandchildren. Or so they believed. Robert and Margaret had 2 sons. The older son, Daniel, owned a struggling construction business. The younger son, Ryan, worked in real estate investments. Both had beautiful homes, expensive cars, successful appearances. Whenever neighbors asked about them, Robert proudly smiled. "Our boys are doing well." Margaret's eyes always sparkled whenever she spoke about her grandchildren. "They're growing so fast." Although both sons lived only a few hours away, they rarely visited. Birthdays, Christmas, family dinners, there was always another excuse. "Work is busy. The kids have activities. We'll come next month." Months quietly became years. Still, Margaret defended them. "They're building their futures. We shouldn't pressure them." Robert nodded, though deep inside, he missed them terribly. One evening, their doorbell suddenly rang. Margaret hurried to answer it. To her surprise, both sons stood outside together. Behind them were their wives, and the grandchildren she hadn't seen in almost a year. Her face lit up instantly. "My babies!" She hugged everyone with tears in her eyes. The house quickly filled with laughter. Dinner was prepared. Stories were shared. For one evening, it felt like the family Margaret had always dreamed of. But later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Robert quietly noticed something. His sons weren't talking about family. They weren't asking about his health. They weren't asking about retirement. Instead, they kept exchanging nervous glances with each other, as though they had come for another reason entirely. Robert didn't say anything, but somewhere deep inside, a father's instincts whispered, something wasn't right. Robert hardly slept that night. Something about his son's sudden visit didn't feel natural. For years, they had always been too busy to visit, too busy to call, too busy even to spend Christmas together. Yet suddenly, both families had arrived together, smiling, laughing, acting as though nothing had ever changed. Robert wanted to believe it was genuine. Margaret certainly did. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. She prepared everyone's favorite breakfast: fresh pancakes for the grandchildren, scrambled eggs for Daniel, toast with homemade strawberry jam for Ryan. She moved around the kitchen with the excitement of a young mother all over again. Watching her smile, Robert couldn't bring himself to say what he was thinking. Maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. Maybe the boys really had come to reconnect. After breakfast, Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad?" Robert slowly looked up. "I thought so." Daniel exchanged another glance with Ryan before speaking. "Our construction company has been struggling," Ryan continued, "and my investment project collapsed last month." Silence filled the dining room. Daniel leaned forward. "We're not asking for charity. We just need a little help getting back on our feet." Robert quietly folded his napkin. "How much?" The brothers hesitated. Finally, Daniel answered, "We were hoping you could lend us your retirement savings." Margaret immediately looked toward her husband. "There are children. If we don't help them, who will?" Robert remained silent. Years of hard work, 40 years of saving, every overtime shift,
Every vacation they never took, every sacrifice, was sitting safely inside that retirement account. It wasn't luxury, it was security. Security for old age, security for emergencies, security for the day their health would fail. Robert looked at both sons. "Will this truly solve your problems?" Daniel nodded quickly. "It will." Ryan smiled confidently. "We only need one chance." Margaret gently placed her hand over Robert's. "They'll never forget what we do for them today." Robert looked into her hopeful eyes. He knew that expression. She wasn't thinking like an accountant. She was thinking like a mother. And a mother's heart rarely measures risk. It only measures love. Later that afternoon, Robert drove to the bank. The manager welcomed him warmly. "Congratulations on your retirement, Mr. Harrison." Robert forced a smile. "Thank you." An hour later, he walked out carrying the documents. Everything he had worked for over 40 decades was now divided equally between his two sons. When Daniel accepted the envelope, his face lit up with relief. Ryan hugged his father tightly. "Thank you, Dad. You've saved us." Margaret smiled through happy tears. "I knew our boys would never forget this." Robert smiled, but something inside him still felt uneasy. For the next few hours, the house felt alive. The grandchildren played in the backyard. Family photographs were taken. Everyone laughed together. It almost felt like old times. That evening, Daniel stood up. "We should head back before it gets too late." Margaret looked surprised. "So soon?" "The kids have school tomorrow," Ryan added, "and we've got meetings first thing in the morning." Margaret nodded understandingly. "Of course." She hugged every grandchild. Then both sons embraced their parents once more. "We'll come back next weekend," Daniel promised. Ryan smiled. "And once everything settles down, we want you both to move in with one of us." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "Really?" "Of course," Ryan replied. "You've taken care of us your whole lives. It's our turn now." Tears rolled gently down Margaret's cheeks. Robert quietly watched. He wanted to believe every word. He truly did. The cars disappeared down the road. The house became silent once again. Margaret stood by the living room window, still smiling. "They've changed," she whispered. "They finally understand what family means." Robert slowly walked beside her. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I hope you're right." Days passed, then weeks. No phone calls, no visits. Every time Margaret called, one of them answered briefly. "We're busy. We'll come next week. Just a little longer." Robert noticed the pattern immediately, but he never said anything. He simply watched his wife continue defending them. "They're under pressure. They'll come, you'll see." Robert only smiled gently. Sometimes, the kindest thing a husband can do is protect his wife's hope, even when his own has already begun to disappear. Nearly 3 months later, everything changed. One rainy evening, Robert was carrying a box down the basement stairs. His foot slipped on the wet concrete. He lost his balance, and the heavy box crashed beside him, and Robert fell hard onto the floor. A sharp cry echoed through the house. Margaret came running. "Robert!" He couldn't move. Pain shot through his lower back with every breath. His face had turned pale. Margaret immediately called an ambulance. As paramedics carefully lifted him onto a stretcher, Robert reached for her trembling hand. "It's okay," he whispered.
But both of them knew it wasn't. The hospital doors closed behind them, and neither of them realized that this accident was about to reveal the true hearts of everyone they had ever trusted. The ambulance rushed through the rain. Margaret sat beside Robert, holding his trembling hand as tightly as she could. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the ambulance siren and Robert's painful breathing. Every bump in the road made him wince. Margaret silently prayed, "Please, Lord, let him be okay." Minutes later, the ambulance arrived at St. Mary's Medical Center. Doctors immediately wheeled Robert into the emergency department. Margaret was left standing alone in the waiting room. The bright white hallway suddenly felt colder than ever before. Every second seemed like an hour. Finally, after nearly 45 minutes, an orthopedic surgeon walked towards her. His face was serious. "Mrs. Harrison?" Margaret stood up immediately. "How is my husband?" The doctor sighed gently. "Your husband has suffered a severe hip fracture. He'll need surgery as soon as possible." Margaret felt her knees weaken. "But he'll recover, won't he?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, if we operate quickly." Then his expression became more serious. "The surgery will cost approximately $80,000. Margaret froze. 80,000. Those words echoed endlessly inside her mind. Just a few months earlier, they had enough savings to cover it. But now, every dollar was gone, given away with love, given away to their own children. The doctor placed a consent form on the desk. "I understand this is difficult, but delaying the operation could cause permanent damage. We need your decision as soon as possible." Margaret nodded silently. "I'll arrange the money." She wasn't sure how, but she couldn't lose Robert. Not now. Not after spending 43 years together. She stepped outside the hospital, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. The first number she dialed was Daniel. It rang several times. Finally, he answered. "Hi, Mom." Margaret immediately burst into tears. "Daniel, your father fell. He's in the hospital. The doctors say he needs emergency surgery." There was a brief silence. Then Daniel asked, "How much?" 80,000. Another silence. Much longer this time. Finally, he sighed. "Mom, I wish you had called a little earlier." "What do you mean?" "I've already invested every penny. The business still hasn't recovered. I honestly don't have that kind of money." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. "But that was your father's retirement." "I know. I'm sorry. I'll see what I can do. I'll call you back." The call ended. No words asking, "How's Dad?" No promise to come. No urgency. Nothing. Margaret stared silently at the phone. The screen slowly grew dark. She wiped away her tears and called Ryan. He answered almost immediately. "Hey, Mom." Margaret repeated everything once again, this time trying not to cry. Ryan listened quietly, then said, "Mom, you know how investments work. Money doesn't just sit in a bank, it's tied up. I can't pull it out overnight." Margaret whispered, "So you can't help either?" Ryan hesitated. "I'm really sorry. I wish I could. We're struggling too." Margaret closed her eyes. "But your father may not be able to walk again." Ryan remained silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, he quietly said, "I have another meeting.
We'll talk later." The call disconnected. Margaret slowly lowered the phone. Not once had either son asked, "Can we come to the hospital?" Not once had they asked, "Is Dad in pain?" Not once had they offered even a single dollar. Margaret walked back into the hospital. She sat alone in the waiting room. The chair beside her was empty, just like her heart. An elderly woman sitting nearby noticed her tears. "Are you all right?" Margaret forced a smile. "My husband needs surgery." The older woman gently touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry." Sometimes, complete strangers show more compassion than family. Late that evening, Margaret called her closest friend, Helen. After hearing everything, Helen became furious. "Margaret, you gave those boys everything. They owe you this. Call them back. Demand your money back." Margaret quietly shook her head. "I can't force my own children." Helen sighed. "Then let me speak to them." Before Margaret could answer, Helen had already begun dialing Daniel's number. Within minutes, both brothers received calls not only from Helen, but from several relatives who had learned about Robert's condition. One after another, they heard the same question. "Your father is lying in a hospital bed. How can you refuse to help?" Ashamed, Daniel and Ryan promised they would figure something out. But neither of them actually transferred any money. Their promises were nothing more than words. Meanwhile, inside the hospital room, Robert slowly opened his eyes. He saw Margaret sitting beside him. Her face was swollen from crying. He smiled weakly. "You've been crying." She quickly wiped her eyes. "No, I'm fine." Robert gently squeezed her hand. "Our boys, did they answer?" Margaret forced herself to smile. "They're trying." Robert looked into her eyes. After 43 years of marriage, he knew every expression on her face. He didn't ask another question, because deep inside, he already knew the answer. And somehow, that realization hurt far more than the broken bone in his body. The next morning, Margaret sat alone in the hospital cafeteria. A cup of coffee rested untouched in front of her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Every minute, she glanced toward the intensive care wing where Robert was recovering. The doctors had stabilized his condition, but the surgery couldn't wait longer. Without payment, they couldn't schedule the operation. Margaret quietly opened her handbag. Inside was a small velvet jewelry box. She slowly lifted the lid. A gold wedding necklace, a pair of pearl earrings, a thin bracelet Robert bought on their 25th anniversary wedding, and the diamond ring she had proudly worn for over 40 years. Each piece carried a memory. Each represented a chapter of their life. She gently picked up the ring.
Robert had slipped it onto her finger when they were only 23 years old. Back then, they had almost nothing. No expensive honeymoon, no luxurious house, just dreams and each other. A tear rolled down her cheek. "I never imagined that one day I'd have to sell our memories just to save your life." She quietly closed the box. There was no time for sentiment. Robert needed her. Before leaving the hospital, she walked into Robert's room. He was awake. His face looked pale, but he smiled the moment he saw her. "Morning." Margaret forced a smile. "How are you feeling?" "I've felt better." He tried to laugh. It hurt. Margaret gently adjusted his blanket. "I'm going out for a little while." Robert noticed the jewelry box in her hands. His eyes immediately understood. "No." "You can't." Margaret looked away. "We don't have another choice." Robert slowly reached for her hand. "I didn't spend 40 years buying those gifts so you could sell them because of me." She squeezed his hand. "They're only things. You're my husband. I'd sell everything I own if it meant bringing you home." Neither of them spoke again. Sometimes love doesn't need words. Margaret left the hospital and took a taxi to the city's jewelry district. The shop owner carefully examined each piece. After several minutes, he wrote a number on a piece of paper. Margaret's heart sunk. It wasn't even half of what she needed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Gold prices have changed. This is the best I can offer." She nodded quietly. Even if she accepted, Robert's surgery would still be impossible. She thanked the man and picked up her jewelry and slowly walked back outside. Rain had started falling again. She stood alone beneath a bus stop shelter. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to cry. Not because of the money, not because of the jewelry, but because she realized their own children had left them completely alone. At that very same moment, only a few blocks away, Ethan Parker stepped out of a black SUV. His life looked completely different now. He was no longer the frightened little boy who begged for food. Today, he owned 3 successful cafes across the city. More importantly, he had built a charitable foundation that quietly helped struggling families, funded scholarships, and paid medical bills for people who had nowhere else to turn. Despite his success, he never forgot the people who had once changed his life. That morning, he had come to St. Mary's Hospital to visit one of his employees whose father had recently undergone heart surgery. As always, he carried a basket filled with fruit and flowers, because Ethan believed no one should face illness feeling forgotten. After spending nearly an hour with the family, he walked toward the hospital reception desk. Just then, he overheard 2 nurses talking quietly. "Poor elderly couple," one of them whispered. "The husband needs surgery, but they can't afford it." The second nurse sighed. "The wife has been crying all morning." Ethan slowed his steps. Something about those words caught his attention. He wasn't curious, he simply remembered too well what helplessness felt like. He walked toward the reception counter. "Excuse me, if it's appropriate, is there any charity fund available for that family?" The receptionist smiled politely. "They've already applied, but the approval process takes several weeks. We don't have that much time." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He thanked her and continued walking. He had no idea that destiny had quietly placed him only a few feet away from the 2 people who had changed his entire life 15 years earlier. And within the next few minutes, everything was about to come full circle. The rain had finally stopped. Soft sunlight streamed through the hospital's glass entrance. Margaret slowly walked back inside, clutching the small velvet jewelry box against her chest. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her steps felt heavier than ever. She had no idea what to do next. She had run out of options. At that exact moment, Ethan was walking toward the main lobby after saying goodbye to his employee's family. As he reached the reception desk, his eyes casually drifted across the waiting area, An elderly woman stood alone near the elevators. Her shoulders were slightly bent. She held an old velvet jewelry box tightly in both hands. There was something strangely familiar about her. Ethan slowed his pace. He looked again. Her face had aged. Her hair had turned silver. But those gentle eyes, those kind eyes, he had seen them before, years ago, on the darkest day of his childhood. His heart suddenly began beating faster. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." He took another step, then another. The memories came rushing back like a flood. A busy street, a hungry little boy, a woman placing money into his tiny hands, a voice that had changed his life forever. "Never beg again, son. Build something of your own." His eyes widened. Without thinking, he hurried toward her. "Mrs. Harrison?" Margaret slowly turned around. She looked at the well-dressed young man standing before her. She searched his face. She smiled politely. "I'm sorry, have we met?" Ethan couldn't stop smiling. His eyes were already filling with tears. "You probably don't remember me, but 15 years ago, you changed my life." Margaret looked confused. "I'm afraid I don't." Ethan laughed softly through his tears. "My name is Ethan. I used to wait outside your husband's office every evening. I was the little boy who begged for food." Suddenly, Margaret froze. Her lips trembled. She stared into his face once again. Then, slowly, the memories returned. The skinny little orphan who used to call Robert Dad. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my goodness! Ethan?" He nodded. She couldn't believe her eyes. You've grown so much." Before she could say another word, Ethan gently embraced her. For a brief moment, it felt as though 15 years had disappeared. When they stepped apart, Ethan noticed the tears still running down her face. His smile faded. "What happened? Why are you here?" Margaret tried to smile. "It's nothing." Ethan gently shook his head. "It isn't nothing." She remained silent. Then, almost as if years of pain had finally become too heavy to carry, everything came pouring out. She told him about Robert's accident, the emergency surgery, the enormous hospital bill, their retirement savings, their sons, the unanswered phone calls, the broken promises, the jewelry she had tried to sell, and finally, she opened the velvet box. "I thought these would save him, but even they're not enough." Her voice broke completely. "I don't know what else to do." Ethan stood perfectly still. Every word felt like a knife. The same people who had once rescued his future were now fighting alone for their own. He quietly closed the jewelry box, then gently placed it back into Margaret's hands. "You'll never have to sell these." Margaret looked at him in confusion. "But Ethan," he smiled gently, "please, go sit with Mr. Harrison. I'll be right back." Before she could ask another question, he walked calmly toward the billing department. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "Yes, I'd like to pay for Robert Harrison's surgery." She typed the name into the computer. A few seconds later, the outstanding balance appeared on the screen. Without asking another question, Ethan handed over his black credit card. "I'd also like to leave an additional $50,000 on the account." The receptionist looked surprised. "Sir, that's far more than the surgery costs." Ethan smiled gently. "I know, in case they need medication, physical therapy, or anything else. They're family." The receptionist processed the payment. Within moments, the receipt was printed. She looked at Ethan with admiration.
"Everything has been approved. The surgery team will be notified immediately." Ethan simply nodded. "There is one favor I'd like to ask." "Of course. Please don't tell them who paid. If they ask, just tell them someone whose life they once changed has finally found a way to say thank you." The receptionist smiled warmly. "I promise." Only a few minutes later, the orthopedic surgeon hurried into the waiting area. "Mrs. Harrison?" Margaret stood up immediately. The doctor smiled for the first time that day. "Good news. The financial issue has been completely resolved. We're taking your husband into surgery immediately." Margaret blinked in confusion. "What?" "The payment has already been made." She stared at him. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't. The account has been fully settled." Margaret looked around the waiting room in complete disbelief. Who would do such a thing? Who even knew they were here? As she searched the crowded lobby, her eyes landed on Ethan. He was standing quietly near the large windows, pretending to admire the rain outside. At that moment, their eyes met. Ethan smiled gently. Not a proud smile, not a smile expecting gratitude, just the same warm, humble smile that kindness always wears. And without saying a single word, Margaret finally understood. Tears streamed down her face. This time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope. For years, she had believed that her greatest gift to Ethan had been £200. But today, she realized the greatest gift had never been the money. It had been the belief that one forgotten little boy was worth believing in. And now, that little boy had returned to save the people who had first saved him. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. Margaret never left the waiting room. Every time the operating room doors opened, her heart skipped a beat. Ethan stayed there too. He sat quietly in a corner, never drawing his attention to himself. Several times, Margaret looked toward him. Each time, he simply smiled reassuringly. For the first time in days, she felt she wasn't alone anymore. Finally, the operating room doors opened. The surgeon removed his mask and smiled. "Mrs. Harrison?" The surgery was successful. Margaret covered her face with both hands. A flood of relief washed over her. Her legs became weak. Before she could fall, Ethan gently supported her. "It's over," he whispered. "He's going to be okay." Margaret looked at him through tear-filled eyes. She couldn't even speak. She simply nodded. Finally, the following afternoon, Robert slowly opened his eyes. Everything looked blurry. Machines beeped softly beside him. His body felt heavy. Then he saw Margaret sitting next to the bed. She immediately reached for his hand. "Robert." His voice was weak. "You look exhausted." Margaret laughed through tears. "I've never been happier to hear you complain." Robert smiled faintly. Then he noticed someone standing quietly near the window. A tall young man, well-dressed, respectful, but strangely familiar. Robert narrowed his eyes. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" The young man slowly stepped forward. His smile trembled. "You probably don't recognize me." Robert searched his face. "I wish I did." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Ethan." Silence. Then, almost like lightning, Robert's memories came rushing back. A frightened little boy, dirty clothes, hungry eyes, standing outside his office every evening. Dad. The boy had always called him Dad. Robert's eyes widened. "Ethan?" The young man smiled. "Yes, it's me." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Robert stretched out both arms. Without saying another word, Ethan embraced him. It wasn't a polite hug. It wasn't awkward. It was the embrace of a father and the son
life had unexpectedly given him. Both men quietly cried. After a long silence, Robert gently held Ethan's shoulders. "Look at you. I hardly recognize you. You've become an incredible man." Ethan smiled. "I became who I am because two people believed in a little boy nobody else could see." Margaret wiped away fresh tears. "You did all of this yourself." Ethan shook his head. "No, you gave me something no one else ever had. Hope. And once someone gives you hope, they change your life forever." A nurse entered the room carrying paperwork. She smiled warmly. "Mr. Harrison, everything has been taken care of." Robert looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The hospital bill, the medications, your rehabilitation program. It's all been paid." Robert looked at Margaret. She slowly smiled. Then both of them turned toward Ethan. He looked down, almost embarrassed. Robert whispered, "You?" Ethan smiled softly. "You once invested in a frightened little boy. This is simply your investment coming back." Robert immediately shook his head. "No, we gave you almost nothing." Ethan laughed gently. "You gave me far more than money. You gave me dignity. And dignity has no price." Several days later, Robert was discharged from the hospital. The doctor handed Margaret a long list of medications and recovery instructions. "Physical therapy will take several months. He shouldn't be left alone." Margaret nodded. "We'll manage." Before they could leave, Ethan walked over carrying Robert's overnight bag. "I've been thinking." Robert smiled. "That usually means you're about to do something generous." Ethan laughed. "I'd like both of you to come home with me." Margaret looked surprised. "Oh, Ethan, we couldn't possibly impose." "You wouldn't. My house is far too quiet. My wife has already prepared your room." Margaret blinked. "Your wife knows about us?" Ethan smiled proudly. "She knows everything. I've told her your story countless times. She says she's been waiting years to meet the two people who changed my life." Robert exchanged a glance with Margaret. Neither of them knew what to say. Ethan continued, "You once told me that begging steals a person's dignity. So today, I'm not offering charity. I'm asking my family to come home." The word family echoed through the room. Margaret quietly broke down in tears again. For years, she had waited to hear that word from her own children. Instead, it came from the orphan boy she had helped only once. Robert reached for Ethan's hand. "If we come, you'll have to promise us one thing." Ethan smiled. "Anything." Robert chuckled softly. "No more calling us Mr. and Mrs. Harrison." A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. "What should I call you?" Robert squeezed his hand. The old man smiled like a proud father. "You've been calling me the right thing since the very beginning." Ethan's voice trembled. "Dad." Robert nodded. "Welcome home, son." 3 days later, Robert was finally discharged from the hospital. The doctor reminded him once again. Recovery will take several months. No heavy lifting, regular physical therapy, and most importantly, don't try to do everything by yourself. Robert smiled. "I'll try." The doctor laughed. "That's exactly what every stubborn husband says." Even Margaret smiled. It was the first genuine smile either of them had shared in weeks. Outside the hospital, a sleek black Range Rover waited near the entrance. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the rear door. Robert looked at Ethan. "You didn't have to do all this."
Ethan smiled. I know. I wanted to. Robert slowly climbed inside with Margaret's help. As the vehicle drove through the city, neither of them noticed the expensive buildings or beautiful neighborhoods. They simply sat quietly, trying to process everything that had happened. Only a week earlier, they had believed they were completely alone. Now, they weren't so sure anymore. 40 minutes later, the SUV turned through a pair of elegant iron gates. Robert looked out the window. Beyond the gates stood a breathtaking 3-story home surrounded by flower gardens, fountains, and towering oak trees. Margaret stared in amazement. "Ethan, you live here?" He smiled shyly. "It's just a house." Robert chuckled. "This is far more than a house. It's a dream." Ethan looked at him. "It became possible because someone once believed I could build a future." Before anyone could ring the doorbell, the front door swung open. A beautiful young woman hurried outside with 2 children running behind her. The little girl couldn't have been older than 7. The little boy looked around 5. The woman smiled warmly. "So, they're finally here." She walked straight toward Robert and Margaret. Without hesitation, she gently hugged Margaret. "Welcome home." Margaret stood speechless. "You must be Sophia." Sophia nodded. "I've wanted to meet you for years." She looked toward Robert. "Ethan talks about you almost every week." Robert laughed in surprise. "Every week?" Sophia smiled. "Sometimes every day. Our children know your story better than most fairy tales." The 2 little children stepped forward. The girl politely held out a small bouquet of flowers. "We picked these for Grandma." The little boy smiled at Robert. "And these are for Grandpa." Robert's lips trembled. He looked at Margaret. Neither of them could hold back their tears. They had waited years to hear those words from their own grandchildren. Instead, they came from children they had never met before. Inside, the house felt warm rather than luxurious. Family photographs filled the walls. A large fireplace glowed softly. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Nothing about the home felt showy. It simply felt lived in, loved. Sophia led them upstairs. She opened a bright bedroom overlooking the gardens. "We prepared this room for both of you." Margaret looked around in disbelief. Fresh flowers, comfortable chairs, family photographs. Even Robert's favorite herbal tea sat on the bedside table. Ethan smiled. "We wanted you to feel comfortable." Robert quietly sat on the edge of the bed. He looked around the room, then looked back at Ethan. "You prepared all this? For us?" Ethan nodded. "You spent years making other people feel safe. It's our turn now." That evening, everyone gathered around the dinner table. Laughter filled the room. Sophia served homemade soup. The children argued playfully over who would sit next to Grandma. Robert hadn't laughed this much in years. Halfway through dinner, little Emma looked at Ethan. "Daddy?" Ethan smiled. "Yes? Are Grandma and Grandpa staying forever?" The room became quiet. Ethan looked toward Robert and Margaret, then answered softly, "I hope so." Emma clapped happily. "Good. Now our family is bigger." Margaret quietly lowered her head. A tear slipped down her cheek. Not from sadness, but because life had given her something she thought she'd lost forever. A family. Meanwhile, across the city,
Daniel sat inside his office staring at unpaid bills. His company was collapsing. Ryan wasn't doing any better. His risky investments had failed unbelievably. Creditors called almost every day.
Neither brother had visited their parents since Robert's surgery. Not once. Then, Daniel's phone rang. It was an old family friend. "Daniel? I saw your parents today." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "They looked wonderful. They were getting out of a luxury SUV. I think they were with the owner of Ethan's coffee house." Daniel frowned. "Ethan? The businessman?" "Yes, the young millionaire. He treated your parents like they were royalty." Daniel sat frozen. He immediately searched online. Within seconds, articles appeared on the screen. Local entrepreneur Ethan Parker expands coffee brand across 3 states. Businessman donates millions through community foundation. From homeless child to self-made millionaire. Daniel clicked one article, then another. His hands slowly began to shake. The photograph on the screen showed Ethan smiling proudly in front of his newest cafe. Suddenly, Daniel remembered something. A skinny orphan boy standing outside his father's office many years ago. His eyes widened. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." At that same moment, Ryan called. His voice sounded panicked. "Daniel, tell me I'm wrong. You've seen it too." Both brothers fell silent. For the first time in their lives, they realized the heartbreaking truth. The boy they had once ignored had become the man their parents now proudly called their son. Nearly 3 weeks passed. Robert grew stronger every day. Every morning, Ethan helped him through his physical therapy exercises. Sometimes they walked slowly through the garden. Sometimes they simply sat together on the porch, drinking coffee while watching the sunrise. Margaret often smiled quietly from the kitchen window. She had never imagined peace could return to their lives like this. One Sunday afternoon, Sophia was baking apple pie with Emma while little Noah played with Robert in the backyard. Laughter echoed through the house. It didn't feel like guests were living there anymore. It felt like 3 generations under one roof. Exactly the kind of family Robert and Margaret had dreamed of. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Sophia opened the front door. 2 well-dressed men stood outside. Both looked nervous. Both carried expensive gift baskets. Daniel and Ryan. Sophia immediately understood who they were. "Can I help you?" Daniel lowered his head. "We're here to see our parents." Sophia remained polite. "I'll let them know." Inside the living room, Margaret looked toward the entrance. The moment she saw her sons, her smile disappeared. Robert slowly placed his coffee cup on the table. No one spoke. For nearly 20 seconds, the room was completely silent. Finally, Daniel stepped forward. "Dad? Mom? We came to take you home." Robert looked at him calmly. "Home?" Ryan nodded quickly. "Yes, our home. You belong with us." Robert quietly asked, "Which home? The one where we waited 2 months for your phone call? The one where your mother sat outside a locked house? The one where your father became too expensive to keep alive?" Neither brother answered. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "When your father needed surgery, I begged both of you. You both said you had nothing." Daniel whispered, "We made mistakes." Margaret looked at him. "Mistakes? A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is burning dinner. But abandoning your parents is a choice." Daniel closed his eyes.
Every word struck harder than any insult ever could. Ryan stepped forward. "We know we don't deserve forgiveness, but please, give us another chance." Robert remained silent. Then he slowly stood up with the help of his cane. He walked toward the window. For several moments, he simply looked outside. Then he quietly spoke. "When you were children, your mother and I never counted how much we spent raising you. We never kept score. When you were sick, we stayed awake all night. When you failed, we encouraged you. When you succeeded, we celebrated. We believed that one day you would do the same for us." He turned around. His eyes weren't angry, they were simply tired. "But when we needed our sons, God sent us someone else's."
The room fell completely silent. Even Ethan lowered his head. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, I've regretted every day since." Robert gently shook his head. "No, you regretted it only after you discovered who Ethan had become." Neither brother could deny it, because it was true. If Ethan had remained poor, they probably would never have returned. Just then, Emma quietly walked into the room holding Robert's hand. She looked curiously at the two strangers. "Grandpa, who are they?" Robert smiled gently. "They're old friends." The answer wasn't meant to hurt anyone, but somehow it hurt more than anything else. Daniel felt his heart break. For the first time, he realized he had become a stranger inside his own parents' lives. Ryan slowly placed the expensive gift basket on the table. "It isn't much, but we wanted to bring something." Ethan quietly picked it up and handed it back. They don't need gifts. They needed their sons, and that was the one gift you couldn't buy. Neither brother could meet his eyes. Daniel turned toward Ethan. "I owe you more than an apology." Ethan smiled politely. "You don't owe me anything. You owe them." He pointed toward Robert and Margaret. "They spent a lifetime loving you. I only did what any grateful son would have done." Those words shattered the last piece of pride the brothers still had. Both men slowly walked toward their parents. Without saying another word, they dropped to their knees. Tears streamed down their faces. "We're sorry. We failed you. We don't deserve to be called your sons." Margaret instinctively wanted to comfort them. That was the kind of mother she had always been. But Robert gently placed his hand over hers, not to stop her from forgiving, but to remind her that forgiveness and trust are not always the same thing. The room remained silent. Daniel and Ryan were still kneeling on the floor. Neither of them dared to look their parents in the eyes. Outside, the evening sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Inside, a lifetime of memories filled the silence. After several long moments, Robert slowly walked toward his sons. His cane tapped softly against the wooden floor. He stopped in front of them. For a second, Daniel thought his father might finally embrace them. Instead, Robert gently placed his hand on each of their shoulders. "I forgive both of you." Both brothers immediately looked up. Hope returned to their eyes. But Robert continued, "I forgive you because carrying hatred is too heavy for an old man. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." The room became quiet once again. Margaret softly wiped her tears. She knew exactly what Robert meant. Love could forgive. Trust had to be earned. Robert slowly sat back in his chair. He looked at Ethan, then back at his sons.
When Ethan was a little boy, he came to me asking for money. I thought I was helping him. Robert smiled gently. But today, I finally understand something. He wasn't the one who needed saving. We were. Everyone looked at Ethan. He quietly lowered his head. Robert continued, "When a person has children by birth, but a son is someone who stands beside you when the whole world walks away." Daniel quietly began crying again. Ryan covered his face with both hands. Neither man had any excuse left. Just then, Robert reached for a small brown envelope resting on the coffee table. He opened it slowly. Inside were legal documents. Margaret looked surprised. "You already?" Robert nodded. "A few days ago." He handed the papers to Daniel. The brothers looked at the first page. Their hands immediately began trembling. It was Robert's updated will. The document explained everything. Their family home, their savings, their investments would be donated after Robert and Margaret's lifetime to a charitable foundation that provided education, medical care, and small business opportunities for orphaned and homeless children. The foundation would be managed by Ethan, not because he was wealthy, but because Robert trusted his heart. Daniel looked up. "Dad, so you're leaving us nothing?" Robert smiled kindly. "No, I'm leaving you something far more valuable." Both brothers looked confused. "My forgiveness, and one final lesson. If money could build character, you would have learned it years ago." Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. She gently reached for Ethan's hand. "You never asked us for anything." Ethan smiled. "You already gave me everything. You believed in me when nobody else did. I've spent my whole life trying to become the kind of man that would make you proud." Margaret stood up and wrapped her arms around him. "My son." For the first time in decades, she spoke those words without hesitation. Ethan quietly closed his eyes.
The little orphan who had once searched for a family had finally come home. Months passed. Robert recovered completely. Every morning, Ethan and Robert opened one of the foundation's community cafes together. Young people who had once lived on the streets now worked there. Widows received free meals. Children received scholarships. Families in crisis received quiet help without ever having to beg. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden plaque. It read, "Kindness is never an expense. It is an investment that always returns." Visitors often admired the words. Few knew they were inspired by a single act of kindness from many years ago. Daniel and Ryan kept trying to rebuild their relationship with their parents. This time, they came without asking for money, without making excuses. Sometimes they simply visited. Sometimes they quietly helped around the house. Trust returned slowly, one honest action at a time, because real change is never proven by words, only by consistent actions. Robert welcomed their efforts, but he never forgot the lesson life had taught them all. One beautiful spring afternoon, the entire family gathered in the garden. Children laughed as they chased butterflies. Sophia and Margaret prepared lunch together. Robert sat beneath an old oak tree. Emma climbed into his lap. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" Robert smiled. "Of course." "How did Daddy become your son if you didn't meet him when he was a baby?" Robert looked toward Ethan. Their eyes met. Then he smiled. "Because families aren't always created by blood. They're created by love."
Emma thought about it carefully, then nodded. I like that better. Everyone laughed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert looked around the garden. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, and the young man who had once stood hungry on a sidewalk, now surrounded by the family he had always deserved. Robert quietly whispered, "Thank you, God. Sometimes you don't answer our prayers the way we expect. You answer them better." The end. Moral: never underestimate a small act of kindness. A few dollars can disappear. A meal lasts a day. But dignity, encouragement, and compassion can change someone's entire future. Because the kindness you give today may one day come back and save your own life.